Today we're going to talk about growth targets related to your student learning objective. I first wanted to share a little bit about your assessment. So this assessment will be what you use for baseline or pre and for post. So this is going to be the assessment you're going to use to evaluate growth across the 10 days of full-time teaching. So you're going to give an assessment before your 10 days full-time teaching. You're going to teach them, do some strategies, and then after the end of your 10 days of teaching, you're going to administer a post-assessment. This checklist is straight from the Department of Education website, and it outlines considerations for you when developing your pre and post assessments. I think it's important to note that all of your SLOs across our whole entire cohort are probably going to look a little different. And that's because your students need different things, your cooperating teachers want certain and different things, and you may not be teaching the same standards at the same time. So please don't fret if your assessment looks a little different than somebody else's. Your best bet is to contact and collaborate with your cooperating teacher. Here's page 2 of that assessment checklist. Here's the final third page of the assessment checklist. I just wanted to remind you about Bloom's taxonomy. So that checklist mentioned that the questions you use on your assessment, depending of course on the standards and topic that you're going to cover, should probably include a range of levels, meaning you should consider Bloom's taxonomy. So if you have questions that are all remembering questions, you're probably going to want to explain why. Typically, you're going to have questions that go through this taxonomy. So you might have basic recall questions as well as creation questions. So asking students to develop their own opinions maybe, or their own inferences, or maybe they have to do some kind of investigation. So just consider this taxonomy as you're developing your questions for your pre and post assessment. For the next few slides, we're going to talk about how to analyze data. Benchmark data helps us compare a student's performance to that of their same-aged peers. And we can do that using the bell curve or the normal curve, which is what you see on your screen. So often you see the bell curve or normal curve associated with IQ. And typically that means people who have an IQ of about 100, or that middle line on the figure, that is typically average. So if you have an IQ of 100, you are typically considered to have average intelligence. Anybody who is one standard deviation or one SD below the mean or below 100 is still considered in the average range. People who are plus 1 SD or one standard deviation above the mean are also considered in the average range. So when we're talking about IQ, our students who are technically between 85 and 115, those would be the score on the IQ test, are in the average range. But our average IQ is about 100. The bell curve also helps us visualize percentile ranks. That is sometimes called PR on some assessments, and that is where we can really analyze our growth or our progress compared to same-age peers. So if I take the IQ example, so I have an IQ of 100, which means I have average intelligence. My percentile rank would be 50, and that means I scored as well or better than 50% of my peers. The higher the percentile rank, the better in terms of intelligence. So if I scored a 115 on my IQ test, I am above the 80th percentile, and that means I scored as well or better than 80% of my peers. If I scored like a 75 on the IQ test, that puts me around the 5th percentile, which means I only scored as well or better than 5% of my peers. So when we look at benchmark data, probably the most important part won't actually be the score, but the percentile rank, because that's going to tell us kind of which tier or which quadrant a student is performing in. So are they performing in the average area around the 50th percentile? Are they scoring in like the 85th to 99th percentile, meaning that they are just way above average, probably exemplary? Or are they scoring on the low end, kind of below the 50th percentile? So that's the number that I really want you to focus on when you get your like MAP scores or any kind of benchmark test. Now we're going to walk you through an example using baseline data to create growth targets. So first I want to give you some background information about this activity. All of these data will be second grade data. They'll be MAP data as well as DIBELS. And DIBELS are just reading probes for those of you not in elementary education. And those baseline data will help us assess pre-performance of our students. We'll also look at some historical or trend data, and that will include MAP data from the same group of students the previous year. So how did they score and grow in first grade? And then we'll also look at some trends from former students. So here's our baseline data. I first want you to look at second grade fall MAP data, which I've enclosed in the red text box. You'll notice that there are only 10 students in this data set, and they each have a fall MAP score, so that's like 182 for student number 1, as well as a percentile rank. So please remember what the percentile ranks mean. The higher the percentile rank, the better. If you have a 50th percentile rank, you're scoring as well or better than 50% of your peers. If you have something lower than that, you're probably below average. So just take a second to review these data just for the MAP reading. Here's the same data set, but now I have put a box around second grade DIBELS. And just remember that DIBELS scores reading achievement. So here we're just given a score. We're not giving a percentile rank. So I have included on this slide what each of the scores mean. So if you'll see the smaller text box at the top of the slide, and I've highlighted beginning of the year. So you'll note that if you got a 141 or above, you're probably at or above the benchmark. If you got between a 109 and a 140, you're kind of below the benchmark. And if you got it between a 0 and a 108, you're well beyond the benchmark. So take a second to analyze these data in those terms. So are they at or above benchmark, below benchmark, or well below benchmark? Just using these baseline data, I can start to create my tiers. So if you'll remember when we talked about the SLO, we could have tiered growth targets, meaning we might have tier 1 for our advanced students, tier 2 for our proficient students, and tier 3 for our students who are probably not performing proficiently or on grade level. So I've highlighted the students who scored well below the 50th percentile, so well below average. So student number 2 scored in the 20th percentile. Student number 4 scored in the 13th percentile. Student 6 scored in the 29th percentile. And student 10 scored in the 16th percentile. So I might start thinking of grouping these students in about tier 3 because they're not performing kind of anywhere near average at this point. Now we can identify the students who are performing above average. And for this data set, I'm going to consider anybody who scores in the 85th percentile or higher as above average. So you'll see student number 3 scored in the 97th percentile, while student number 9 scored in the 86th percentile in these data. So these are the two students I would start to consider putting in tier 1 of my growth targets. So they can probably score more or higher on the assessment that you're going to give, and I might need to consider enrichment and acceleration when I'm planning for them. Finally, I can identify the student scoring at or near average. So I might identify student number 1 because that person is performing in the 65th percentile. Student number 5 is performing in the 78th percentile. Student 7 is performing in the 75th percentile, and student 8 is performing in the 76th percentile. So these students would probably be a part of tier 2 on my growth targets. So they are performing around average. So the State Department of Education recommends that you consider these 3 questions when analyzing your pre or baseline data. Number 1, how are students performing overall? Are most students consistently demonstrating proficiency? So in the data set that we looked at, 6 of the 10 students were scoring at or above average. Number 2, are there clear student groupings? Yes, I think that our tier 1 students would be the 2 students who are performing above 85th percentile. Our tier 2 students would be those 4 students performing around average, and our tier 3 students would be the 4 students who are performing below average. And number 3, what other data would be useful to include when determining student readiness? So I noted that I think it's interesting that student 4 and student 10 are performing in the 13th and 16th percentile, because that is so low. That's nowhere near the 50th percentile. So I think I would want more information or more assessment data than these 2 pieces of information, map and dibbles, in order to learn more about what these students can and cannot do. In order to make growth targets for our students, it's also important that we consider historical or trend data. So in the next few slides, we have the trend data for the same group of 10 students, and I have noted on this slide the 4 students who are performing below the 50th percentile. So you'll notice student number 2 in the first grade fall map was scoring in the 16th percentile. In the winter first grade map, 22nd percentile, spring of first grade, 34th percentile, fall of second grade, 25th percentile. So that student has consistently been scoring in the kind of lower percentiles. Look at student number 4. You can see across 18th percentile, 20th, 16th, and 13th. Student 6, the 32nd, 33rd, 33rd, and 29th, and student 10, the 24th percentile, 20th, 16th, and 16th. So you can see across the data, across a whole year of data, that these students were never near the 50th percentile. They've always scored lower, and that's going to be important when we're thinking about tiering our students, but also those growth targets. Here is the trend data for our students scoring in the above average range for second grade. So you'll notice student number 3 has scored consistently in the at least the 90th percentile or higher, much higher, across the year, and student number 9 has scored in the high 80s typically for percentile across the whole year. Now look at these trend data for our students who will likely end up in tier 2. So you'll see student number 1 ranked in the 67th, 68th, 72nd, and 65th percentile. Student 5, 73rd, 78th, 80th, and 78th. 7, 71st, 69th, 76th, and 75th. And student 8, 54th, 52nd, 51st, and 76th. So that student jumped up a good bit between spring of first grade and fall of second grade. So these data are historical or trend data for different groups of second graders. So you'll notice the first part is last year's second graders, and then the second half of this chart is 2 years ago. So this is how typically second graders progress or make growth on map data in second grade. So if you'll notice the range of student scores on the left, and then it says fall, winter, spring. So if our students made a 159 in the fall on map, they probably made a 172 or 178 by the end of the year for that group of students. If the students made between a 164 and a 172 in the fall, their scores were somewhere between 179 and 185. And this is important because it's showing you the amount of growth these students made. So the student who made a 164 and now makes a 179, we can actually say they scored a 15 points better. Okay? For our students who were higher in MAP, so they scored a 190 in the fall, they typically were scoring like a 202 to 209. So they were increasing about an average of 12 points as well. 2 years ago, so that whole different group of second graders, you can see their scores from fall, winter, and spring and calculate that growth across the year too. So you'll take the fall scores and compare it to the spring scores, and that's how you can determine the average growth for these students. Based on that historical data, so of the different groups of second graders, we can determine that the mean growth for students last year was just over 16 points, and the median score for the growth was about 15 points. If we look 2 years ago or multiple years ago, we can determine that most students grew about 12 points or better. This is going to be so important for us because this is how we're going to determine our growth targets. So if most of the students were scoring 12 to 15 points better from the beginning of the year to the end of the year, then that's probably going to be where I start for my tier 2 students. So if I'm expecting them to grow at an average rate, I'm going to expect them to grow anywhere between 12 and 15 points on MAP data from fall to spring. Okay? If they're in tier 1, meaning advanced, maybe I'm expecting them to grow more than 15 points from fall to spring on MAP. If my students are in tier 3, meaning they need some help, we're not progressing at an average rate, I'm probably going to anticipate or expect them to grow at a rate less than 12 from fall to spring. When considering your growth targets, it's important to remember that you're only teaching for 10 days for this SLO. So all of the data that we just looked at were growth targets from fall to spring. So that's like 9 months. You have 10 days. So I do think that your growth targets will be a little different, and that's totally fine. I also think it will depend on what kind of assessment you use for pre and post, which I also think is fine. So I suggest you work very closely with your cooperating teacher for this, and if you have any questions, please reach out to me as well.